Coming up on this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society, the Super NES is holding down the 12 tabletop at the local brew pub. It's checking its phone and hoping to God that someone shows up. It's dangerous to go alone, so the Nintendo Cartridge Society goes with ya. Welcome to Nintendo Cartridge Society. My name is Patrick Ellers, and I am joined, as I am always joined, by my co-host, Mark Mitchell. Mark, how's it going?
It's going great. I am in a little bit of a singy mood
Oh,
right
okay.
now.
Singing some songs.
On the way
Yep.
over, I was singing in the car. Before we were recording,
Mhm.
I couldn't help myself.
What were you singing in the car?
What was I singing in the car?
And were you singing because you were driving fast or because you were driving slow? You know the difference.
I do know the difference. Okay, I'll tell you. And this is just between friends. What I
Right.
was listening to on the way over here.
Everyone listening to this show, your friends.
Yeah.
Got it?
I was listening to the soundtrack to Disney's Tarzan by Phil Collins.
Yes.
Singing along to, like Son of Man
Mhm.
and the other songs on that soundtrack.
Wait, which one is You'll Be in My Heart? Is that
That
that's the
is
main
the
one?
ballad from it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it a ballad when it's between a mother and son? I guess it's still a ballad.
It's still a
right?
ballad.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't
Yeah.
think ballad I think ballad technically just means something that is sung.
Oh, okay.
Like,
then it's a
yeah.
ballad then.
I'm sure some purists would say, like, well, no, obviously it has taken on a more specific meaning since then. But I don't think it has to be romantic. It can just be an expression of love.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to use it however I want because language is constantly evolving.
That's right. Another thing that is constantly evolving, and I am not segueing to the Sonic versus Borrowing program just yet, but I was recently listening to the Disneyland music. There's like a collection of Disneyland music on Apple Music. And there's like the whole part of like the evolving music from the Tarzan Treehouse, part of which is You'll Be in My Heart, but the rest of it is like more instrumental and like, like as you're walking through there.
Oh, yeah. It's all like,
Like,
drums and stuff like that.
Drums, and then like it sort of slowly becomes the song, and like
Mhm.
depending on where you are in the space. Disney is so good. And look, is this like 6 episodes in a row where we started off talking about Disney topics? Maybe. But as you're going through, they're so good at like isolating their Sonic
Yeah.
experiences. It's truly
I
magic.
did watch the Spider-Man trailer, by the way.
Oh yeah, it's great, right?
Yeah, it's good. I have to admit, I don't like Doctor Strange. Don't care for Benedict Cumberbatch as
Yeah, you got
Doctor
it.
Strange.
Yeah, he's him doing the American accent is always like, it sounds like it's too big in his mouth or something, right?
Every time I see him, I'm reminded of how much I didn't like the first Doctor Strange movie.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, if he's gonna be like a foil for Spider-Man in this one, like I'm for it. Speaking of foils, I blew the only good transition we were gonna have. My copy of Sonic Forces. Would you like to borrow it? You can if you want to. It is my copy of the game for the Nintendo Switch. All you gotta do is email us at nintendocartridgesociety@gmail.com and give us a mailing address where we can mail this thing to you. You play it for as long as you want. You send it back. There might be a copy of Untitled Goose Game in there. It's just something you got to deal with.
The other thing you can do is leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, or really wherever you get your podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Patrick, are you still using Apple Podcasts? I know that there was a moment where you had a
Right.
crisis of faith.
Yeah, and I continue to have this crisis.
Mhm.
I've kind of just resolved myself to be in crisis forever. And is that a reflection of like where we are with the coronavirus? Like probably. That I just don't think I deserve good things anymore.
Well, but here's a good thing that you
Yeah.
can give Patrick, and really anyone who's interested in Nintendo. If you leave us a 5-star review, or favorite us, or a 4-star review, basically on your podcatcher of choice, if there is a way to say, hey, I like this show, do that. We will shout you out. It helps us out a bunch. It helps people find the show. It helps pull Patrick back from this downward spiral
That's
that
right.
he's in.
I mean, we'll see about that one. But all the rest of it's true. Also, October is Game & Watch month. We are quickly approaching the entire month of October. And during that month of October, the entirety of it, we're going to be talking about Game & Watch, the hardware, the software, everything related to it. It's a little bit of a new frontier for Mark and I, as neither of us grew up with like an abundance of them. We know a little bit about it. So we need a little bit of your guidance, your experience with Game & Watch, your suggestions about what topics in Game & Watch we should explore. So email us at nintendocartridgesociety@gmail.com and let us know what about that interests you. If we don't get any suggestions, then we're just going to have to make stuff up, which I'm comfortable doing.
I mean, I feel like we're holding a loaded gun at people, but that is the truth. We'll just have to come up with something.
We'll just have to come up with something. And it'll be, I'm confident it'll be a fun month either way, but it's more fun to have listeners engaged in this and playing some Game & Watch games with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Mark, we have a fun topic today. We are celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Let's get into it. And Mark, how better to celebrate the 30th anniversary of something than by generating a list of our 30 favorite features of the Super NES.
This was a really fun list to come up with.
Mhm.
So I have done 15. Patrick has done 15.
Plus.
And so, which is good because we're going to have a list at the end of the night of 30 unique things.
Yes.
And so where Patrick and I, if there is overlap, then we will have to come up with something else. So it's good that you have extras. But I have to tell you, I really enjoyed putting this list together. I love the Super Nintendo.
Yeah, me too.
I have such fond memories of it. And so, like, just thinking about the Super Nintendo all day, jotting down my thoughts about the Super Nintendo, it was like spending, like, the perfect day at the beach. Just, like, the warm sun of the Super Nintendo.
Honestly, it was like spending the day with an old friend, right? Like, it felt social to me to be, like, writing down, not that I would ever make lists of my favorite attributes of my friends. I've never done that, Mark. But if I were to, I imagine it would feel a lot like this. We find ourselves with a bunch of Super Nintendo games on my kitchen table, which is where we are recording this. My copy of Final Fantasy II, my copy of Battletoads and Double Dragon, my copy of Mortal Kombat 2, my copy of Beethoven Ultimate Canine Caper. Like, they're all here. We've also got the Super NES Classic Edition and a Super Nintendo controller. Just so if we ever need to, like, reach out and feel like the tactile sensation of these things, we've got it right here. I do think that since Mark and I are both American boys who grew up as American boys, we are going to be talking about the Super NES as it appeared in North America, which means we are talking about the little gray and purple thing. We are talking about the light purple and dark purple buttons. We are not talking about a Super Famicom. We're not going to talk about any Fire Emblem games, probably. So this is the North American experience of the Super NES. I'm correct in assuming that that's also what guided
for
you
sure.
Here. Yeah.
Yep.
So when we say things, like our favorite things about it, I don't know about you, Mark, but I went both very specific in being like this game. And I've also gone a little bit broader to be like this concept, this trend in games, or this feature of the hardware or whatever.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we understand that some things are going to be broader, some things are going to be more specific. What do we do when inevitably someone says, like, I said this category of thing, and then someone else is like, I have a specific example of that thing? Are those two different features, or will we have to handle that on a case-by-case basis?
It seems to me like we're going to have to handle it on a case-by-case basis because, I don't even know what we would do with a specific example.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we just will. I'm just saying, this is another one where we have to resolve, as always.
Yes.
To come out of this as friends.
Yes. I mean, what a sad day it would be if at the Super Nintendo's 30th birthday party,
I know.
This podcast dissolved.
I mean, it's a high drama scenario, a birthday party, especially a big one like a 30th.
Yeah.
Friendships could end. Is all
midlife crisis.
And it's funny to think of the 30-year anniversary of a console as the middle of its life. It absolutely is not. Mark, let's start throwing some things onto this list so people can get a sense of what the heck we're even talking about. would you like to go first and offer your first favorite thing about the Super NES?
Yeah, and I'm gonna start very simple, and I'm just gonna say I love the name of the Super Nintendo Entertainment
Oh,
System.
Mark, that's so good.
It's something that we would never see ever again.
Mhm.
But the naming of it is like
Game Boy Advance, sort of, but yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a good. Okay.
Arguably Wii U, but keep going.
I just love it though. I love that it's like the simplicity of like, hey, you had the Nintendo
Yeah.
Entertainment System. Well, guess what?
Yep.
Buckle up, kids, because now it is like the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. There's
Yep.
something so simple about it. It just makes me think of the episode of The Simpsons when everybody is obsessed with like Bone Crusher.
Yeah. Whoa, Bone Storm, right?
Bone Storm.
Yeah, that's
right. The like fighting Mortal Kombat-esque video game
Right.
that Bart really wants for Christmas, and like Millhouse is sitting there and just being like blown away by it.
Yes.
That is like the image that the name Nintendo Entertainment System conjures to me as like a little kid just sitting in front of the TV, just being blown away by the magnificence of it.
Can we go a step further with that and say that the super branding, just like on top of that, is a stroke of genius? We obviously already have like Super Mario Brothers like as a concept,
Oh yeah.
so it's already sort of like floating out there in the ether. But then the Super Nintendo turns every game into super whatever. Even like licensed games when they would come over, or third-party games. It's Super Castlevania. It's Super Star Wars, right? So when like Super Metroid comes out, you're like, yes, this is the game for this thing, and it's super.
Yeah, and it all felt of a piece with like the marketing and everything, where it's like now you're playing with power, and it just felt like yes, I am. And because it was such an big leap from what the capabilities of the Nintendo Entertainment
Yeah.
System, it really did feel like it was leveling up.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. I love that. So we have down here, or I have written in our list here, that the first thing is the name and just the brand Super in general. That's brilliant, Mark. Such a good start to this thing. I'm going to maybe this is, well, here's one of my favorite things about the Super NES. Is the Nintendo S-SMP sound chip, developed by Sony, and put into this tiny little box that makes it sound like no other piece of hardware on the market. It is an 8-channel sound chip that's twice as many channels as the NES, and it functions based off samples. A lot of preloaded samples, including that sort of like funky bass that you end up hearing in a lot of early Super NES games, but also with the ability for composers to upload their own sound samples, which is how you get the sort of gorgeous orchestral sounding scores of the Final Fantasy games and like anything else, especially later in the system's life, where it just sounds like there's a tiny little symphony inside this thing. You weren't getting that on Genesis. Genesis has its own cool sound chip, but it's not the S-SMP sound chip. And it also like it represents a partnership with Sony, which, like, you know, during this era leading into the Nintendo 64 is right as the chasm is forming between them, and they would never work together again. But it's such a good sound chip.
Yeah, the 16-bit era, so the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, that is the sound of video games to me. That's like my nostalgia sweet spot when it comes to video game music, because and the Super Nintendo more than the Genesis, because I didn't own a Genesis, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't until later that I started hearing those soundtracks, knowing more about those games. And the Super Nintendo, just like the sound, the music from the Super Nintendo era, I like video game music today can be amazing, but it is there was something about like the limitations of the sound chips in like these 16-bit systems, where now it's like you can literally do anything you want.
Right, of course.
And you know, like, I don't know. There's something like intangible about that just lives in my mind.
Yeah.
Just it's very sticky.
Yeah, and it's totally like the clarity that the like chip provides is you know, one of the big things that's different from the Genesis. The Genesis kicks out at like a little bit lower fidelity, which is can sometimes be awesome, right? Like those kind of like crunchier sounds of like a Sonic the Hedgehog game. But man, there's just nothing to me as like clean and awesome as like a Super NES soundtrack, like firing the way it's supposed to.
Well, my what we'll use for number 3. So my next
Yes.
favorite thing about the Super Nintendo is I want to touch on those regional differences.
Ooh, okay.
Because I think that is another thing that has been lost to time, is that like now video games become so big worldwide and there's such a global community that when Nintendo releases a system, it has the same name worldwide.
Yeah.
Games systems are region free now. You can pretty much play any game from any region that you want to. But that was not the case in the era of the Super Nintendo, right? Like each area of the world, like each region got
Has
its
a different
own
experience
version
of this thing.
of
Yeah.
the Super Nintendo. So, like you mentioned, Patrick, the North America Super Nintendo that I know and love is this little gray box with purple buttons. In Europe, the buttons on the controller, and I guess Japan, the buttons on the controller are green, blue, red, and yellow,
Yeah.
which I think looks super cool.
It looks so good. My new 3DS has that same button color layout, and I love it. I wish they would do it like all the time.
And then in Japan, it is of course the Super Famicom.
Yep.
Playing off of the Famicom system that was the Japanese equivalent of the NES. And so, and like game name differences, like Star Fox being Lilat Wars,
Mhm.
and all that kind of stuff. It's just I'm not nostalgic for that time, but it is like a very specific experience that doesn't exist today in video games.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, just we'll talk about some of the like RPGs and stuff that are on the system later on, I'm sure. But like, there were a bunch of Fire Emblem games that came out in Japan that we never got here and have never had an opportunity to play. Like, there are all these like, I feel like there are these like sort of holy grail of like someday some of these things will be localized and come over. It's an exciting era of region specific features and games.
Yeah.
What a good pull, Mark. We've done 3 sort of abstract things, or at least 3 non-game things. So I'm just gonna pull out one of the big guns here. Mario Paint. Mario Paint was a unique game in that it was arguably not a game. It was an art studio. It allowed you to do animation. It allowed you to make stamps. It allowed you to make music. But the thing that I really want to drill down on right now is the absolutely astounding Mario Paint Player's Guide from Nintendo Power. If you've never seen this thing, I urge you to look it up. Mark, I'm even saying this to you right now. The Mario Paint Player's Guide. It is a like 140-page guide from Nintendo Power, like they would do, during this time. Except since it's just an art game, it's like, what could they possibly give you to do? And the guide had all of these like cheat sheets and instructions for making cartoons and music featuring the following. Buckle up here, okay? Dr. Mario, Link to the Past, Star Fox, Lemmings, Santa Claus, Street Fighter, Ninja Turtles, The Moon Landing, Beethoven, Galileo and the Planets, baseball, including stamps for all the MLB team logos, the NFL, including 3x3 stamps for every team helmet, Bart Simpson, Polk, or Plock, sorry, Mega Man, Battletoads, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, Wizards of Oz, Star Wars, Spider-Man, and a ton of other music. And there are instructions in this player's guide to hook up your VCR and like make your cartoons and like make music videos. And they have this whole big example of an animated music video to Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. And like, it's just, this player's guide is it's art school, right? And it is the instruction manual basically for how to make great fun things with Mario Paint.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now, and it is really, really cool. And kind of surprising, the stuff that's in here. Like, I wonder if they officially licensed it. Like, because they specifically call out, like, Disney stuff. Like, in Disney's Peter Pan, Peter could swoop and soar like a bird. And then there are illustrations of Disney's Pinocchio made in Mario Paint.
Right.
Disney's Alice in Wonderland and White Rabbit. Like, unmistakably Sleeping Beauty, like, Maleficent.
Yeah. And, there's like Street Fighter art in here. They show you like pixel by pixel how to make like full versions of Chun-Li doing her her lightning kick.
The album covers for Velvet Underground and Nico, Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, Guns N' Roses, Use Your Illusion 2.
It's incredible, isn't it? And I mean, this was my Bible when I was playing playing Mario Paint and like making my own cartoons. And occasionally I would like use the sprites that they give you and just sort of like alter them to make them my own. I know for sure that I hooked up my VCR to the Super Nintendo so I could record like 4-second chunks of animation and like totally like link together a whole little movie experience. And I wouldn't have known to do that. I wouldn't have known how to do that without this player's guide. I don't know if this is the last time we're going to talk about player's guides on this list. I know there's another big one that is important here. But the Mario Paint and the Mario Paint player's guide were just absolutely crucial experiences for me for the Super NES.
Well, can I just tell you my experience with Mario Paint, which is so different from yours, because we got Mario Paint, just the cartridge, loose, like secondhand, probably from somebody's garage sale.
No mouse?
No mouse.
Oh my
I
God.
had no idea that Mario Paint had a mouse until we did this show and you talked about it at some point. So that Mario Paint can do all of these things, and that they kind of like guided you to do all of these things is so amazing to me, because I think of it as just like a blank canvas that I would like doodle on for a little bit,
Right.
and then just not really understand what to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, the possibilities of Mario Paint is still amazing to me.
Yeah, truly endless at that time. Like, you know, I was comparing it to like MS Paint or like Kid Pix or like any of those programs that I you know, those like just drawing programs. And the fact that it lets you do animation, lets you do music, and even do the like pixel by pixel sort of like sprite art. Really, really cool. I love it.
Also, great music.
Oh yeah, phenomenal music.
Okay,
and a fly swatting mini game called Coffee Break.
All right, my next one is actually, I'm gonna go ahead and like piggyback off of that a little bit, because my next pick for favorite thing about the Super Nintendo is just game manuals in general.
Okay.
And these don't exist anymore. And they kind of started falling out of favor in like the GameCube era, and now they basically don't exist at all. But there was a time where every game came with like a booklet, and
Yes.
inside the booklet would be like the plot for the game basically written out. You'd have the enemies, and you would have the characters, and you would have like how to play the game and
Yep.
how to control it and everything. And these are real like works of art. Like, they are so fun to go back. The ones for the Super Nintendo Classic Edition are online. So for like Star Fox, Star Fox 2, Donkey Kong Country, all of those exist online.
They went back and made one for Star Fox 2? Or was it like, were they ready to publish it with the game?
Maybe I'll eat my words about Star Fox 2 and just say
Okay,
Star
all right,
Fox,
sorry.
because I know for sure there is one for that. But you know, like when we were doing our look back at Super Nintendo games in April of 2020, that was like a resource that was really fun to go back to and see. Or even when we were doing the Kid Icarus month, that was another one where it's like, oh, let's go back, look back at the manual and see what like the story was. And just being as a kid, like flipping through those books, getting all of that information was something that was always a lot of fun.
I think there is something like the distinction between the sort of NES era of game manuals and the Super NES. The NES is a little bit more unhinged, right? I feel like that's where there's more like sort of like off the wall art, and more where it's like someone's translating something and trying to make sense of it. And I just feel like it's a little bit more put together in the Super NES era.
Just like everything else with the Super Nintendo, like the ambitions were bigger. People had the NES under their belt, and so they were like, okay, we know how to do this. Like, Princess Toadstool is this, Koopa is this. Like, we're all going to get our acts together now. To a degree.
To a degree. Right. There's some places where they didn't. Okay. Should I do another game or another like sort of abstraction?
Well, I'll tell you, I'll do another game next. So maybe if you want to do an abstraction.
Okay, I'll do an abstraction, which is actually going to be a sort of a collection of games. I'm talking about the 2D fighting game Explosion. Obviously started in the arcade, but the Super Nintendo made it possible to bring that experience home cheaply and pretty convincingly. I'm talking about games like Street Fighter 2 and its various incarnations, Street Fighter Alpha and the various versions of that came to the Super NES. I'm talking about Mortal Kombat, which I know the Genesis had the blood code, but like it's a better game on Super NES. It has a higher frame rate. It has enough buttons to actually play the game the way you're supposed to play it. It's just better on there. I'm talking Killer Instinct. I'm talking Clay Fighter. I'm talking Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighter. There are so many of those games that like came out at that time, which were big in arcades, but then were accessible at home. Best on the Super NES. And yeah, I know like Neo Geos exist, but like, do they really?
Well, it just wasn't the common experience,
right?
To like be able to play a game on the Neo Geo. Neo Geo is another thing that like I didn't even know it existed at the time. It wasn't until I was an adult that I knew that Neo Geo even existed. It is a real snapshot of the Super Nintendo era that fighting games were king.
Yes. Well, and specifically Street Fighter 2, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you look back at any video game magazine of like the early 90s, they're just about Street Fighter 2. And this is like after the game had been out for months, and like every new version of the game that came out, the Turbo or Championship Edition or Super, every single version was like a new like milestone. It was a new like thing to discuss and to buy, and it was just it's a killer version of the game.
My next pick is a game. It is Stunt Race FX.
What are we talking about here, Mark?
This is one of the first games that my family got when we had a Super Nintendo, and it is a treasure to me. So Stunt Race FX is a racing game, but you are like, it heavily relies on Mode 7 and this like faux, maybe it's not even Mode 7.
No, it's not Mode 7. It's a Super FX chip.
It's the FX chip, which would make sense for Stunt Race FX. So it has this like polygonal.
We'll come back to Mode 7, by the way.
Yeah. So like kind of like Star Fox-esque polygons put together look to it, and I think it's on the Super Nintendo Classic Edition.
It is, yeah.
And tried to play it again, and it is a rough play now. It is really slow. There's lots of slowdown because they're doing a lot of things to be flashy with the graphics. Like when your car crashes, it all like blows apart, and the individual polygons like blast away at a really slow frame rate.
If you want to see some triangles fall.
yeah. And the vehicles themselves, there's like different cars you can choose from, and they all have these big like googly eyes on them. But I absolutely loved this game. And I mean, I can't really defend it.
This is an amazing pull,
but it's a classic to me. It is a game that I associate with the Super Nintendo and with that era so strongly that it brings me joy just thinking about Stunt Race FX.
I'm going to keep us in that same ballpark, and I will submit Star Fox to the list. Another game that takes advantage of the Super FX chip, which actually lets the Super NES render polygons. Should not have been possible, but it was. The Super FX chip was something that they were like developing close to the release of the Super NES, but couldn't get it in the actual hardware itself, so it had to go out. And the technology to do 3D graphics is in the cartridge. It's so wild.
Yeah.
But anyway, Star Fox is a game that you can basically all of the complaints that you can level against Stunt Race FX, you can also level against Star Fox, right? Like it is slow. It drops frames. It has a low frame rate to begin with. But Star Fox is so imaginative with its characters, and the moment-to-moment gameplay is so rewarding and so engaging. When you and I went back and played it again, I guess April of last year, like I was blown away by how much fun I was having while playing it. It's just such a solid game that like looking at it, you're like, oh, they were boxing above their weight. But then you get your hands on the controller, and like they weren't. They were doing what they were supposed to be doing.
Yeah, the original Star Fox, and is such a kind of like amazing alchemy of all of these elements that I love.
Yes.
It has like Star Wars. It has this kind of like Indiana Jones swagger. It like, is this mind-blowing graphics video game on the Super Nintendo with like really cool character designs
Yes.
that were like felt really approachable but like fun, almost like like capturing that like Disney-esque magic of like their Robin Hood and that kind of stuff. And man, I did not have a good opinion of this game until like we went back and replayed it. I think it is really difficult to play on a big screen TV. The best way to play it is on like a handheld,
Yeah.
where the graphics are like a little easier to make sense of.
Yeah,
But-
or if you've got like a computer monitor that you can hook your
Yeah,
Super NES
yeah.
Classic up to. Yeah.
But it's really easy to get lost in it, like you're saying, because once you can look past it, playing Star Fox was like watching a Shakespeare play.
yes.
Where in the beginning you go in and you're like, okay, like you are playing catch up
Yeah.
in the first like
Mhm.
few scenes because you're trying to like get into the groove of it. But once you do, and once like you get into the language, then you're able to forget all of that and just like really enjoy it.
Yeah, I do think it does take the conscious decision to be like, I'm going to have fun with this, and then you will, and the game rewards you for like having that buy-in. It's also like underrated how trippy and weird the game can be in moments where you're like flying through black holes and whatever.
Yeah.
Like they really just, because the palette is so limited and because they can show you so few polygons, they really do make the most of it and like present some strange, abstract, wonderful things to you. Star Fox is an instant classic. 25 years in the 25 years later.
So my next one, I kind of need your help with this, Patrick,
Yeah.
because I don't want to step on the toes of potential other callouts like Star Fox, but there's something about these core like Nintendo first party published games that as a collective, it's like remarkable. I'm talking about A Link to the Past, Super Mario World, Super Metroid, Super Mario Kart. Star Fox is up there, where it's like these entries in the franchise like they're taking it to these games to like another level.
Yeah, so I have something like this in my list too, that I just call getting it right this time.
Yeah.
And for me, it's there aren't any new entries in there. So Mario Kart wouldn't be in that. Star Fox wouldn't be in that. But Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Mario World. I also have Mega Man X in here, where it's like they took exactly what the 8-bit games were doing and were like, no, now we can do it right.
Yeah, there's something about the 16-bit era
Mhm.
that it's like the 8-bit era, everybody had all of these ambitions, and there are so many games like the original Final Fantasy where they are butting up against the limitations of the system really hard.
We're so hard, yeah.
But in the 16-bit era, like they were able to fulfill basically all of the ambitions that they had from the 8-bit era and like render them in the way that it feels like render them in the way that like they envisioned it to actually be.
Right. And it doesn't always make for a better game. Like something like Super Castlevania, for example.
Totally.
Not as good as maybe any of the NES Castlevanias. But maybe I don't know. I don't really care that much. But like for especially coming out of first party Nintendo, where it's like, yeah, absolutely. When they took a swing on NES, it was good or even great. Like I'm not going to say that Metroid and Zelda and any of the Super Mario Brothers aren't great games, because they are. But these super versions of them are all better.
Yeah, I mean, I just remember in A Link to the Past, when you get the first handful of pendants,
Yeah.
and then the world like changes.
Yes.
And it's just it's an experience that now you take for granted in Zelda games and in a ton of games. But at the time, for me playing it, that was a transformative experience, where it was like what games can be now is just so much bigger.
So what do we want to call that? Do we want to call that like the evolution from 8-bit? Do we want to call that 16-bit perfection? What do we want to call it?
I think like I like 16-bit perfection, because like it laid like the foundation for these series
Totally.
like all over again,
Mhm.
right? Like Super Mario World introduced so many elements to the Mario series
that we may talk about.
that we may talk about later.
Coming up.
But like Link to the Past, same sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
Like Link to the Past really set the formula for what Zelda games were. Same with Super Metroid. ish. Only there just weren't that many Metroid games after the fact.
Yeah, but there also weren't that many Metroid games before,
Yeah.
right? Like there were just the two of them, and really Super is like, no, this is how we make these games. And every game, even the Prime games, right, which are played in a totally different like perspective, take all of their best cues from Super. So great. I'm glad that we both like agree with this sort of nebulous idea. I do just want to tack on that I think Mega Man X is the like idealized execution of a base Mega Man game, like rivaled only by like maybe 2 or 3 of like Mega Man 2 or Mega Man 3. 2, 3, and X in my mind are like the pinnacle of that series. So now to me, hey, let's just talk about the thing that we teased earlier, Yoshi. Yoshi is a building block of the Super NES. He is the thing that introduces Super Mario World as something new and unique and more powerful than Mario had ever been before. But he's also the cornerstone for Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island. He's a playable character in Mario Kart, which is like, what? And this is also as we're starting to see those like Yoshi and Yoshi's Cookie, like those games like come up. Yoshi is a star, and the Super Nintendo is his vehicle.
And the timing of Yoshi is just so serendipitous because the early 90s, the world was gripped with dinosaur mania, thanks to like Jurassic Park. And so the fact that there was now a dinosaur in Mario, it was just mind-blowingly amazing.
Yeah. So Yoshi is the extent of that entry of our favorite things on the Super NES.
The next favorite thing that I'm going to submit for our consideration is the Super Nintendo controller.
Yeah, baby.
The Super Nintendo controller is maybe the greatest controller of all time.
It is certainly because this is on my list as well. It is the controller on which all subsequent controllers are based.
Yeah.
With the exception of the Wii Remote. Everything else has looked at the Super NES controller and said, how can we modify that to make it a little bit better? But that's it. All you can hope to do is make this controller a little bit better.
So the Nintendo controller, I guess I should say, the controller for the Nintendo Entertainment System, if you've never held one in your hands, it is a square.
Yeah.
With sharp edges. And
it's a rectangle, but
it's a rectangle with sharp. We can edit out the fact that I called it a square. That would be amazing, though, if it was a square. A rectangle with sharp edges, not super comfortable to hold for long periods of time. The Super Nintendo controller, like weird bulbous things at the end that you can just like cup in your hands so beautifully.
Yeah, they just fit in the palm of your hand.
It introduces the shoulder buttons at the top, like the L and R. It has 4 face buttons
arranged in this diamond, which again, I don't know how to impress how meaningful it is that everyone does it that way.
And then the D-pad, which really could be its own entry in this list, and maybe should be, because it is once again the perfect,
we only have 30 spots. So.
it is once again the perfect D-pad. I feel like everybody's been chasing that perfection since, and for the longest time, at like my parents' house, there would be a Super Nintendo, all of these years, and the D-pad would get stuck or it wouldn't work that well. And so when Nintendo released the Super Nintendo Classic Edition, and I was able to hold like a new Super Nintendo controller in my hand again and feel like the texture of the plastic and everything, like it was a pretty cool moment because I just love this controller so much.
Yep, it's fantastic. Also, as long as we're talking about the, we mentioned the multicolored buttons on the European and Japanese Super Nintendo and Super Famicom, but the purple and light purple, look, I know that maybe they're objectively ugly, but they're imprinted on my heart and I love them. But I also love that the X and Y buttons have the concave curve to them, and the A and B buttons have this convex curve to them, so that even if you are not looking down at the controller, even if you get a little bit disoriented, you've got one extra cue telling you what button you're about to push.
It's such a cool attention to detail, and something that we like never really saw ever again. I feel like all controller buttons are convex now.
Yeah.
And I don't know why. I want it back. Ooh, just pressing these like start and
I
select
know, they're
buttons.
so good. I mean, start and select are the worst buttons on that controller, but like,
They're really mushy, but there is just like a sensory memory.
yeah. And I mean, you're also right about the sensory memory of the like texture of the plastic, that it's not smooth. It's got like a little bit of something to it.
Yeah.
That just feels great. Mark, I am in love with this list so far. It is all of my favorite things about one of my favorite things in the world. But I think now I've got to say a specific game. And I'm going to go with Chrono Trigger. Um, a game with characters designed by legendary character creator Akira Toriyama, developed by Dragon Quest, Yuji Horii, and Final Fantasies Hironobu Sakaguchi, with music by Mitsuda and Uematsu. It's a time-traveling epic with multiple endings. It is like simply one of the best role-playing games ever.
Yeah, games of all time.
Yeah, one of the best games of all time. And it is a late Super NES game. It was one of those they printed and charged $80 for, and it's worth every dime.
Yeah.
Even in 1994 money or whenever it came out. It's just an absolutely beautiful game that addresses concepts of like change and destiny and doom and sadness, and it just a stunningly beautiful game, and perfect in its original release. It would later come out as part of a Final Fantasy collection on the PlayStation with sort of added anime style cutscenes.
Mhm.
But there are like loading problems. The quickness of the cart to load you into and out of battle and into and out of menus made the game so snappy, so fun, so engaging. I love Chrono Trigger, and I love it as it appears on the Super NES.
Yeah, I mean, what is there more to say about Chrono Trigger than you already said? It is a perfect game. And I played it most recently all the way through in its DS release.
Mhm.
And those included the cutscenes
Yeah.
from the PlayStation release. And then it also had some like additional like extra content. But playing it again in my 20s at that point was such a different experience playing it as a kid. Partly because I had played more RPGs
Mhm.
after that, and also partly because, and man, this is so sappy, but it's just like the themes of Chrono Trigger, I feel
Yes.
like are so like universal, and they hit differently when you're older than
Yeah.
when you're young.
Well, and like to that point, they're maybe less universal than something like the other Final Fantasy games, which are on my list, and so we'll talk about them. But that like they, it's about getting older. It's about the things you lose as you age. Um, it's about the world not being what you expect it to be,
Yeah.
or what you thought it was going to be. It's about traveling into the future and discovering that the world is ruined. It's about going into the past and discovering dinosaurs. Like, there's so much depth to the narrative experience of Chrono Trigger that, like, I don't know. I have had magical experiences with only a handful of video games, like truly magical ones, right? That like feel as though they transport you somewhere else. And Chrono Trigger is just constantly doing that.
Yeah. And it's one of those games that could never be replicated.
Yeah.
I as much as I love Chrono Trigger, I've never played Chrono Cross, so I can't speak to it. But occasionally
It's okay.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it necessarily had to be so different.
Hmm.
And I feel like I kind of never want Square Enix to make another entry in the franchise, because the alchemy of Chrono Trigger can't be replicated.
Yeah, and well, I mean, that's one of the things that's like mind-boggling as you look back on it. That the game was published by SquareSoft. They were not Square Enix at this time, but because Akira Toriyama and Yuji Horii are involved, it has a lot of Dragon Quest DNA. So like, it's almost the proto Square Enix game. It's like,
yeah.
and when even now, like, it sort of seems like what Square is doing and what Enix is doing, and they're not really the same. But in this game, like, it really is combining Dragon Quest ideas with Final Fantasy ideas, and the most beautiful product comes out of it.
Yeah, and the music.
Oh
Oh my gosh.
God.
The music is so good.
It's stunning, yeah.
It's so good.
Aided, of course, by that Nintendo S-SMP sound chip.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, my next entry on the list, it's a little broad, but it's important to me just to talk about RPGs in general. The Super Nintendo is an RPG like machine,
Yes.
and for me it was my real introduction to RPGs because as a kid, being younger on the RPGs on the Nintendo Entertainment System were too complex, too opaque, too crushingly unforgiving
Yeah.
that like it was not a genre I ever got into. And just like we were talking about like these other games like A Link to the Past and Super Mario World, like 16-bit perfection, I feel like that is so true when it comes to RPGs. The ambitions of these creators, like the technology finally caught up to it,
Yeah.
and they were able to render these like fully realized worlds and create something like Chrono Trigger, which just wasn't possible before. And so the breadth of what RPGs could be with like Super Mario RPG and Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy, and you have all these different entries. Like it was again just like a really like special time in video games.
Yeah. So it won't surprise you to know that I have both Super Mario RPG and Final Fantasy as a franchise sort of like listed here as separate items. But I think we can probably find a way to either. Well, so what are you referring also to like Secret of Mana in this too, or is that maybe a little bit outside of not totally fit the brief?
No, I mean for me it really is just like this was what I would say is my introduction to RPGs.
Yeah.
For real. And
Yeah.
so it's just like RPGs is the thing that I want to celebrate.
Okay. Okay. So do we want to call out individual titles or not?
I don't know. Do you have individual titles on your list other than Chrono Trigger?
Yeah.
Then let's not. Let's
Okay, all right,
let's
all right.
keep it just as RPGs as a general category, and then we can talk about the virtues of each individual game like we did with Chrono Trigger.
Sure. Okay, great. Then yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you that this is just where storytelling in games kind of matures to a point where like they can actually do something. They can actually give characters character. They can give them wants. They can make them disappointed in things. They can make them want stuff. Yeah, it's powerful, and the combination of the sound chip and the graphics and the high color output that the Super NES had, like, just means that they were able to deliver some like truly stunning and unique worlds. Should I name a? I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna say
Let's
we're gonna live in this.
Let's live in RPGs for a little bit.
We're living in RPGs. My next entry here is just Final Fantasy as a franchise. And I gotta say that the experience of Final Fantasy as an American Super Nintendo Entertainment System owner is truly remarkable because we had the original Final Fantasy on the NES and then nothing for many years. Then we get what we saw as Final Fantasies 2 and 3, which are the best of the next 5 Final Fantasy games, right? Handpicked and changed just enough for American audiences to wrap their heads around them. Final Fantasy 2 and Final Fantasy 3, or 4 and 6, their Japanese numbering, are both masterpieces. They tell such big, world-spanning, world-ending, traveling to the moon stories that have enormous casts of characters. There are 14 playable characters in Final Fantasy 3. 14, Mark. And again, you know, it's a lot of the same stuff that we were saying about Chrono Trigger, in that like the music is gorgeous, the graphics are gorgeous. They both use the Mode 7, which is the ability of the Super NES to render a single large image as one polygon. So it's used mostly for like map traversal, right? And it just gives that little bit of extra perspective so that it seems like what you're seeing is like fading off in over the horizon. And that the game just feels like a globe-trotting adventure, which of course it is. They're so good. And then there is also Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, which is like the hyper dumbed down Final Fantasy game. You ever play Mystic Quest?
No.
It's not good. But like it's immediately recognizable what it is, that it's supposed to be like the accessible entry or like the kids entry or whatever. So really those are the 3 Final Fantasy games that came out for the system, and it feels like it is before the I mean, if we were making a list of like our favorite things about the PlayStation, I would also say Final Fantasy, because 7, 8, 9 like kind of continues this. And man, there was a decade where Square Enix was just the best. But yeah, this is the Final Fantasy games to me are so synonymous with my SNES experience.
Yeah, I haven't played a Final Fantasy game since 13, and so I can't speak to like the experience of modern Final Fantasy, but I feel like something has been lost in the transition to HD. And so that's really why I think like the Super Nintendo era up through the PlayStation 2, it was like just the right amount of technology,
Yeah.
you know, where like it was still you could still render these worlds to the best that the machine was able to do, but it was within the scope that made it like manageable. And I kind of miss what Final Fantasy was. I feel like Final Fantasy doesn't have heart anymore as much as it like
It's a little too cold, right? It's kind of gotten to the point where it's approaching what those like character concept sketches look like, which are cool, but not as much. Like, they're not as warm to engage with as these like really engaging little sprites.
Yeah, and it's just like the stories that they used to tell, the presentation that Final Fantasy used to have, it was more like heartfelt. It was more sincere.
Yeah, more earnest.
Yeah, and more hopeful than I feel like modern Final Fantasy has become.
Yeah. Also, I gotta say, the hallmarks of Final Fantasy, the like chocobos and Moogles, are so great in a pixelated abstraction, and are so weird when rendered in any photorealistic detail. Where you're like, what? If you show me an actual giant yellow bird, I'm gonna ask why people are riding it. If you show me a little like cartoon of it, I'm like, yes, that's right.
Well, we have mentioned it multiple times, and so I think we should just go ahead and put it up here, post it as an entry, and Mode 7 is something that I love about the Super Nintendo. One of my favorite things about the Super Nintendo. Mode 7 was one of those, I don't even know, was it hyped? Like, was it a big part of the marketing, or was it just something that like fan magazines and people would talk about? Because you have never seen video game graphics like Mode 7 graphics before, and you will never see them ever again.
Right. Because it is born out of such a specific set of limitations, and like it's not like a weird buzzword. There actually were 6 previous like graphical modes that all have to do with like layers of transparency and like how many colors that it can display at one time. And Mode 7 was just like
happened to be the 7th.
Just happened to be the 7th one. But like it sounds so cool.
It does
Mode
sound
7.
Amazingly cool.
Mark, what are some of your favorite games to feature Mode 7 graphics?
Super Castlevania 4.
Yep.
Uses Mode 7 in such a wacky way. It's using it to like warp the room around you, so it seems like the room is spinning.
It rotates it, yeah.
Yeah, like it does all of this weird, trippy graphical stuff. Other game like F-Zero is a great example of another way to use Mode 7,
which is the same way that Mario Kart uses it as well.
Right, it becomes, and it was, I guess, like the first game to feature Mode 7 that way since it was a launch title.
Yeah, I guess Pilot Wings too, right?
Sure, yeah, where it's just using one enormous sprite as like a world map.
Yeah. Yep. And you also got to remember. So yeah, like you mentioned Super Castlevania. There's that the level where you are going through the rotating like tower parapet that's all done with like warping a single image into with Mode 7. Yoshi's Island uses Mode 7 in the touch fuzzy get dizzy level sort of famously to when you touch the bad guy that it like everything gets wavy. It's just such a it's just an incredible use of technology where like it can't. There's so many things the Super NES can't do, but they're like, but we can do this.
Yeah, just like the Super Nintendo sound chip, right?
Yes.
Like, it's the limitation of the system that makes it entertaining, because now you could do any of this stuff. You could do all of this stuff. You
Right.
could do more,
Right.
and we don't even blink an eye. But there's something about like the like
It's like the audacity, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like I can't, like, how dare you try and pass this off? But it's so charming, and like,
yeah, that's the word I was striving for. Is just like
it's like the Muppets.
the fact that it's so primitive and like in the sense that it's like the Muppets, where it's like it feels very handcrafted.
Yes.
Where you feel the life behind the game, because even though it's rendered in sprites, you can feel like the hand of the person who made it.
Yes, the hand of the creator.
When there were only one set of footprints on the beach, that's
was
when Mode
Mode 7.
7 carried us. That's right.
There is Mode 7 in Chrono Trigger, in basically all these games. Like it was a tool that like developers knew how to use well, and it
Mhm.
was just fun basically every time. Oh, Mark, where do I go from here? We are halfway through our list, by the way. We have 15 items, and we're going to 30. You feeling good? You feeling like
great.
we can do this? Okay. Mark, here comes a curveball. Jurassic Park for the Super NES. An absolute mess of a game. This is the only platform that this version of the game appeared on. It is very, very unlike the Genesis Jurassic Park game, which is like a 2D platformer where you alternated between playing as Grant and as a Velociraptor. In this, you play. It's like an overhead sort of Zelda style view, like adventure game where you are outside avoiding dinosaurs and trying to escape Isla Nublar. Except when you go inside buildings, at which point it becomes a virtually unplayable first-person shooter. And I think it's achieving this through Mode 7, but it might be through some like other Doom-esque like cheats of the graphics. But the game is expansive. It is long. There's no save feature in this game or password feature. I beat it once with my buddy Pete. What's up, Pete? We're talking about Jurassic Park for the Super NES. And it's was something where we had to like leave the system on overnight and like just hope to God that nothing happened to it. I don't even know if it's a good game. In fact, it probably isn't.
It's your Stunt Race FX.
It is my Stunt Race FX, absolutely. Plus, it's Jurassic Park.
Yeah. What you were mentioning about the Genesis version being so different, I feel like that's kind of a lost art.
Yeah.
It happened a little bit in the Wii era, where companies would make like PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 version, and then somebody else would make a Wii version. Like we saw that with the Alone in the Dark reboot that Atari did, and like stuff like that. But nowadays it's like a game comes out and it's either coming to these platforms or not, for the most part.
Right. Or it's like a less graphically impressive version of it.
Yeah. They just kind of like scale that up and down. Whereas before, it was just like, no, these are completely different games made by completely different teams. Because the technology is so different that like there's no point in trying to make the same thing.
And the market is different too.
Yeah.
Like, Genesis was billing itself as like the cool one. It's not your dumb old dad's video game system. And the Super NES was like, yeah, we're your dumb dads. We're for dads too.
Yeah.
And like this game had that sort of like slow plotting adventure, like kind of pacing to it. And I just loved it. Just love that game.
So I know we've already talked about RPGs, but one aspect.
I'm not done talking about RPGs.
Good, because neither am I. This is kind of like the cross section of that 90s attitude that Nintendo had with like playing with power.
Yeah.
And running headfirst into the JRPG explosion on the system. And that is the marketing for Earthbound.
Oh my.
Which I think is partly, if not mostly, responsible for the awful sales that the game ended up having outside of Japan. And that is because the marketing, I mean, Earthbound would be a hard game to market. I'm not saying I have like necessarily better ideas on how to do that, but the route they went doesn't really make any sense. The main marketing component were like magazine ads that proudly proclaimed Earthbound, this game stinks. And then
it's a scratch and sniff ad,
it's
right?
a scratch and sniff ad, and it'd be like a 2-page spread in the magazine and what it would have is different enemies from the game and the terrible smells that they emitted, and then you would scratch and sniff it. Um, I don't know exactly what they were thinking, but looking back on it now, when we can still appreciate Earthbound, like it didn't, like Earthbound still exists. They didn't Virtual Boy it out of existence or anything. But um, so looking back on it now, we can laugh. And at the time, I didn't think anything of it because I was a kid. But
Yeah, it's
what were
sort
they
of
thinking?
it's leaning into the sort of like Boogerman, Ren and Stimpy sort of like aesthetic that was like hot in the 90s, but like yeah, it doesn't Earthbound is such a sincere game
I know.
that like stapling that kind of like irony to it like just doesn't work. But yeah, I mean because I also have Earthbound as one of my sort of like backup things to talk about here. And specifically its player's guide, also from Nintendo Power, which leaned really heavily into those same sort of like marketing beats that you're talking about here, where like there's a lot of extra art and a lot of extra concept art of the enemies looking grosser than they do in the game. And of course, because the game is limited, right, by its 16-bit graphics. And the game has such a simple art style that like it could have probably appeared on the NES and been fine, right? Like the colors are important, so that probably wouldn't have really worked. But the player's guide, so much of it is just like 2-page spreads of like postcards from that town. This is another one that I absolutely encourage anyone to look up, because it's gorgeous, it's weird. There are like collectible cards that you can like cut out of like the enemies, so you can like shuffle through them and like see who you're fighting while you're playing. It's all just so weird and lends to the overall weirdness of Earthbound, which is, for all of its sincerity, a weird game.
Yeah.
And so like the entire experience, the player's guide, the game itself, the marketing was an alchemy, like you said before. Like it is an non-tangible experience that is almost impossible to replicate now. It's still a good game. It's still a playable game. It's on the Super NES Classic Edition. It's not on the Switch Online yet.
It's not
right?
yet.
It's a crime. But like if you do have the ability to play this game, like go find that guide, print it out, like play with it next to you. It's absolutely worth the bizarre experience.
Yeah, because Earthbound is a very strange game.
Yeah. It's like a Dragon Quest game that takes place in modern day, but is obsessed with the sort of like sadness of suburban life.
Yeah, but also with like pop
culture.
Pop culture. Yep. Earthbound, compared to Chrono Trigger, which I have warm feelings about, Earthbound I like admire academically, but I find it alienating.
Yeah, and I think you're supposed to. Like,
yeah.
I think the game is alienating. And also like it's such a weird part of Nintendo history, right? Because it is a sequel to is the original Mother an NES game, or is it also
an NES game?
An NES game. And the prequel to Mother 3, a game which will never be localized. So like there's just like all this like mystery around it, right? Like you're right to say that I also would like the game from like an academic standpoint, but also from like a almost anthropological standpoint of like, look at the weird piece of video game history this thing represents.
Yeah, totally. Man, I was just Googling it to make sure I remember it right. The box art for it in North America is just so bizarre.
Yeah.
And it's like the big like yellow
the Starman,
like,
yeah,
with like spikes on his shoulder and head. And it doesn't tell you anything about what the game is, and the game has such an appealing look and such appealing characters that I do not understand what happened with Earthbound.
Yeah, the weirdest possible marketing. And it was also, wasn't it sold with the game guide? So it came in this enormous box.
I don't remember.
I just remember it being super weird. Mark, let's stay on this like super weird. And this is a niche game. And did I just talk about Jurassic Park, which is a game that only I've played? Absolutely. I'm going to do it again. We're talking about Secret of Evermore, which is a sort of spiritual sequel to Secret of Mana, except it is developed from Square's like U.S. offices, and with a solely American audience in mind. You play the role of a kid from the small town of Podunk, USA. Literally, that's the name of the town. And he gets sucked into the world created by the imagination of four people at a mad scientist dinner party from the 1950s. It's yeah,
as one that old trope.
And then it plays out in a like action RPG style game where you travel between these four magical lands. Your dog is with you. He transforms with every new world that you go to. I absolutely adore Secret of Evermore. I hate that it is like relegated to the dustbin of history because it is not part of like Square Japan's like portfolio. This is one of those games where like I would believe it if they were like, yeah, we don't know where the code is for that. Like it was dumped a long time ago.
It makes total sense to me that you love Secret of Evermore, and sorry, I'm just updating the list as I'm talking because I realized I typed Secret of Mana, which is not what I intended to type. But yeah, it makes total sense to me that you love Secret of Evermore because to me it is like Square's Star Tropics.
Yeah, yes, absolutely,
and has like very similar vibes.
I'm holding back Secret of Evermore right now.
Yeah, I've never really played it. I have played a little bit with you, and so I can't really speak to like the Secret of Evermore experience. But I'm glad it's on this list because I know how important it is to you.
Yeah, hugely important to me. All right, Mark.
Okay, my next entry.
By the way, how deep are we into the list right now? We've done 18, so we are almost 2/3 of the way through.
Yeah. So my next entry, I'm going to do a game, or really a game series, and that is Donkey Kong Country. I feel like it is worthy of its own entry on this list because Donkey Kong Country, especially the original game, I mean, really exclusively the original game if we're talking about games I like really experienced and loved when I was playing a ton of Super Nintendo. The original Donkey Kong Country was another one of those that I just poured hours into. I have such fond memories of playing with my family, having the Les Miserables soundtrack on, having to be rainy outside. Right, like this is one of those like formative video game experiences that has imprinted on me a love of video games, and I owe that to the beauty of Donkey Kong Country. I think it is a very like, and maybe the sequels they would get better at it, but I think even the original, the music is great.
Yeah,
the art is great. There are parts of it like where the backgrounds and the world maps are just like really beautiful, like more than a Donkey Kong game. That stars these like grotesque looking crocodiles.
Yeah, we're on record not being big fans of the rare
seem
design
to warrant,
aesthetic,
but it is that like perfect mix of just like amazing artists doing amazing work on this Donkey Kong game, which I feel so much is like the magic of Nintendo, right? People at the height of their creative talents working on something for the intention of it being super fun.
But the thing is, it is not just like the geniuses at Nintendo doing something, because this is a game that was developed by Rare using Nintendo characters, right?
Oh, totally.
And is in a lot of ways sort of recognized as by Nintendo as like a little bit of a sidestep from what they do, right? Like there are all these rumors recently of there being a new Donkey Kong game that probably won't have the country branding on it because the country games are always made by Rare or Retro.
Yes, but the rumors are also that the people who are making this game now, they grew up with Donkey Kong Country. So whether it is a country game or not, like I think that whatever internal struggle there was with Nintendo over embracing it or not embracing it, I think Donkey Kong Country has become Donkey Kong.
Well, it's so the original Donkey Kong comes out on the original Donkey Kong Country comes out on the Super NES in 1994. Also in 1994 is Donkey Kong 94 on the Game Boy. But prior to that, the last Donkey Kong game that they made was Donkey Kong 3 in like 1986. So like this is a dead and or dormant franchise. And, for Nintendo like presents their version of it, which is like, oh, here it's this, the sort of puzzly platformer. And people are like, oh, that's nice. It's fun. It's probably the best version of Donkey Kong we're going to get. And then Donkey Kong Country comes out and is like, it's a whole new thing. They invented a new Nintendo franchise from existing pieces. And I just think it's remarkable how special that is. That like that's not a thing that happens. That's not a thing that happens.
No, and it is something I think Donkey Kong Country has like subsumed. Is that a word?
Sure.
Taken over.
Yeah, there we go.
Taken the place
Yeah.
of regular like arcade Donkey Kong in the general consciousness, right?
Yeah.
When I think of Donkey Kong,
Consciousness.
when I think of Donkey Kong, I see him wearing a tie.
Yeah, but hey, doesn't he always wear the tie?
Does he in the arcade games?
I don't know, but I see him looking like he does in Donkey Kong Country. And I think Diddy should be there, right? Like,
yeah,
it's the world of Donkey Kong Country has totally replaced the non-mythology of Donkey Kong from the original arcade games.
Yeah, R.I.P. Stanley.
R.I.P. Stanley from Donkey Kong 3. R.I.P. Donkey Kong Jr.
Oh yeah, big R.I.P. to Donkey Kong Jr.
He's out there somewhere. Mark, that's a great one. It's on my list as well. I'm starting to get nervous that we're not going to have enough. But here we go. My next entry is the Super Game Boy. If you wanted a piece of technology that was delivering the play your handheld games on your TV 25 years before the Switch came out, you had it. It was called the Super Game Boy. You could plug your Game Boy games into a extra tall cartridge that would stick out of your Super NES, and you could play Game Boy games on your TV. You could play them in color. You could play them in like extra color if it was a Game Boy Color game, and you could like add art in the in like the borders. You could do that with the mouse that you got with your copy of Mario Paint. It's and for someone like me that had so many Game Boy games, it effectively doubled my Super NES library, right? Like that's just a perfect place to play Game Boy games on your TV. The only way to do it.
Yeah, yep. The Super Big Game Boy was so much fun. It felt like magic a little bit to me. Well, the next entry for me, I just want to sing the praises a little bit of the SNES cartridges.
Yes.
And cartridges in general. When I was thinking about this list, I was kind of reflecting on the fact that I have gone all digital for like 2 console generations now. And it's much more convenient. I don't have to have a place to like store things. But on the Switch, I think I have 2 physical games. One is Ring Fit Adventure.
Because you can't buy it digitally.
Yeah, and then I bought my copy of Super Mario 3D All-Stars. That one's physical as well. And while I'm like happy with having digital games because there's a lot of things that are convenient about it, and I don't really like consider it, when I was thinking about this list, I forgot like how fun it can be to have like the physical media.
Yeah, totally.
And cartridges, of course, would kind of be Nintendo's downfall in the Nintendo 64 era, but there's a reason why Nintendo uses game carts for the Switch. It's because cartridges have a lot of virtues. Like you were saying for Chrono Trigger.
Oh, the zero loading.
Loading. Like there are a lot of great RPGs on the PlayStation, but I would be loath to play one on the original PlayStation nowadays because the loading is brutal.
Yeah.
And never a problem on cartridges.
No, it just doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it did mean that the games where, I was saying that Chrono Trigger was one of those $80 games. I'm holding a copy of Super Street Fighter 2, which I'm also pretty sure sold for $80 when it originally came out. So they were expensive, but they are handsome little boxes, right? I was thinking earlier about the sort of like 3 main console cartridges from Nintendo, the NES, the Super NES, and the Nintendo 64. And the Super NES is the only one where you can see the name of the game from reading the top of the cartridge, right?
Can you not on a Nintendo 64 cartridge?
No, Nintendo 64 cartridge is
just
just a gray, yeah. And like so I think the Super NES cartridge looks like, with its like longer rectangle, like not as tall as the NES carts, and without that weird little notch in it. I think they're so cool. And there's that like clear plastic thing that like would slide on the bottom and which you lose immediately. I don't have any. But it's such a cool little way to like keep the dust out of them. I think it's a little less cool than the big black sleeves that NES cartridges go in. But I agree with you. The cartridge form factor is just so nice.
Yeah, and just aesthetically, I feel like there's such a upgrade from the NES,
Mhm.
which were they were like big, they were bulky, they were probably trying to be a little more like VHS tapes or something.
Yeah.
But there's just something very satisfying about a Super Nintendo cartridge.
I do think it's a bummer that the Link to the Past cartridge was not gold.
Mm-hmm.
But there were also, I feel like, especially in the beginning, they weren't doing like special colors. I believe Killer Instinct was black.
I don't think I owned any that were anything other than the standard gray.
I know Spider-Man Maximum Carnage was red. But yeah, Mark, that's a great pull. The form factor of the Super NES cartridges. Next. I'm going to go with Harvest Moon. A precursor to Stardew Valley, a precursor to even sort of Animal Crossing. It's probably the first game I played that wasn't full of either puzzles or violence. You just get to raise a farm and be there for 2.5 years, have cows, get a horse, get married, have kids. That's truly the kind of game that like I had not conceptualized as a kid, and just encountering it and like buying chickens and growing. I don't know. It's obviously such a primitive version of all those other games. But to me, it was the original, and it's just one I always look back to as like a marker.
And I think the Super Nintendo game is the one that has withstood the test of time. Like, I think is the version of these farming games. Like, you know, we went back to the Super Nintendo one for the base of the Game Boy Advance version.
Yeah.
And, you know, like, Stardew Valley, one of the biggest indie games of all time, got successful because it went back to this formula that people loved and made a ton of sense. It was really simple, that the Harvest Moon franchise had gotten away from as it tried to, like, you know, move into 3D. And it's like, no, like, for whatever reason, this genre works so well in this, like, simple form.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is, like, what people want. It is the most satisfying.
Yep.
Well, I feel like we'd be remiss to not spend a little bit of time talking about, or talking more about The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. I feel like it is deserving of its own entry. It is such an anchor of not just the Super Nintendo experience, but of The Legend of Zelda as a series. We probably don't need to belabor it too much. We have talked probably too much about A Link to the Past on this show. It is definitely one of our biases.
Yes, we did posit earlier as we were trying to modernize all of the Zelda games
That it's perfect.
that it's perfect and it should not be updated in any
Which,
way.
I mean, really, what more need be said other than just like Chrono Trigger and just like some of these other games that we've talked about, it feels like the ambitions of the Zelda team finally were met by the technology. And it is kind of a perfect game that continues to have profound effects on what The Legend of Zelda is today.
Yeah. Yep. And is so full of individually great and or moving moments. Like I can't think about Link to the Past without seeing the flute kid who gets transformed into a monster in the Dark World and then into a tree when you play music for him. I can't help but think of like the very end credits music, which is just a stunning musical experience, again aided by the Nintendo S-SMP chip. And it's a wholly remarkable, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful game. I've got another entry like that, but I'm gonna save it for later. I'm going to say Turtles in Time. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time. There are a handful of good brawlers on the Super NES, including like the SNES version of Final Fight. But that game is a little bit lacking. I miss the third playable character, and like it's just not a wholly accurate arcade port. But Turtles in Time, man, it's sort of like the perfection of that style of Ninja Turtles game that I hope we're going to see like another good version of in Shredder's Revenge when that comes out. But like it just takes you to such interesting places. You fight prehistoric slash. You travel to it's again time travel, right? So you're going to the future, you're going to the past. You fight pirates, and it's a 2-player simultaneous Ninja Turtles game. It's just a really good, really satisfying arcade port.
Okay, I have at least one more kind of difficult to wrap your head around. But I guess not head. It's a very simple concept. Wrap your arms around, maybe. But I want to talk about the joy of opening a new game in the era of the Super Nintendo.
Okay.
Because this is I guess a combination, like a Lego building block of some of the things that we've talked about before, but I do think it's like a distinct experience. Like when you got a Super Nintendo game for the first time, it was different than getting a video game today, because you would open up the box, there would be the cartridge, there would be the manual, which was like such an important part of it. There was the whole like sensory experience of the printed ink on the paper, and like the cartridge coming out of its packaging. Like it's something that today, without like the manuals and with just like the more simple like clamshell cases, is just different than how it used to be.
Yeah,
and it was something that was like singular.
And there was a possibility, especially with these RPGs, that there was like a map in there too. And also like the games all rested, because the box was bigger than the cartridge itself. So the games all rested in this like little like cardboard box inside the box, if that makes sense. And like, yeah, I also have this like the same sort of like sense memory of like that cardboard, that waxy cardboard. Yeah, it is a cool experience.
And for me, it was such a rare experience too, because most of the games that we got them from garage sales. We got them when they were super cheap. Like we got them when Blockbuster was getting rid of them because and Nintendo 64 was coming out, right? Like, and so to get a new video game was a very rare experience. And I felt like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, just like savoring that chocolate bar, like slowly unwrapping it. It was such a fun part of the experience.
I bet all that gold makes the chocolate taste awful. Is that what he says? All right, Mark, I'm going to talk about Super Mario RPG right now. And look, did we have RPGs as one category and then list several different RPGs as different categories? Yes.
I promise you there's another game coming up.
Is it warranted? Absolutely. Super Mario RPG. This is a Nintendo and Squaresoft collaboration, the likes of which we would never see again, where Square is making a game the way they make games, but with Nintendo characters, and inventing Nintendo characters that people still talk about to this day. Is Geno going to be in Smash Brothers? The answer is no, never.
There's only one character left.
Yep, Mallow. But it's just such a fun and like approachable, accessible game. I can keep talking about how good Squaresoft was at making RPGs for the Super NES, but I can just say this is another example of that. It's amazing to me that this creates a genre of game that Nintendo has been chasing for the last 20 years and been unable to replicate, with the few rare exceptions of like some of the Paper Mario games, or the Mario and Luigi games. They're all like a little bit not quite what Super Mario RPG is.
Yeah, it's just different. I mean, it's like when they tried to get Arrested Development back together, right? It's like, how can you replicate that specific moment in time where Square was at the height of its powers, Nintendo was firing on all cylinders, and so, like, how do you even try? I love a lot of the Paper Mario games, but they just have different goals, right?
Yeah, totally.
Made by different teams. So, my next entry on the list is the Sony PlayStation. It is one of my favorite things to come out of the Super Nintendo. The genesis of the PlayStation is, of course, that Nintendo and Sony were working on what would be like a add-on for the Super Nintendo that was be made by Sony that would play CD-ROMs. And like in one of the great moments in corporate backstabbing, like literally the day it was supposed to be announced, Nintendo just like stopped talking to them and announced that they were going with the Philips CDI, which of course turned out to be a huge debacle. But out of that, Sony was like, all right, well, we're just gonna like get into video games, and proceeded to eat Nintendo's lunch for like 2 generations.
Yeah, well, and aided in no small part by a company we have not stopped talking about this whole time, SquareSoft and Square
Yeah.
Enix. The Final Fantasy games that were so good on the Super NES became so good on the PlayStation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow, what an interesting like perspective on that to say that the PlayStation is one of your favorite things about the Super NES. I get it. It's
Because like the
I love
PlayStation
it.
would not exist
Yeah.
if it had not been for this like erstwhile collaboration between the two companies. Like I don't know that Sony would have ever gone down that route. And the PlayStation has, is like the PlayStation brand is one of the greatest in gaming.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and like it's also crazy. You can trace it back to the initial launch of the Super NES. We're talking about this sound chip, which is designed by Sony. Like they were buds. They were working it out together, making an awesome system together. And well, Sony then was like, well, forget it. We're just gonna do our own thing. Nintendo had to like stumble and like get back to a place of relevance and then dominance, and there've obviously been ebbs and flows there, but yeah, it truly is. There would be no PlayStation if Nintendo weren't a weird backstabbing. But can you imagine if they were the same, if it was the Nintendo and Sony Switch?
No, like what? Yeah, it is difficult to imagine like what that road looks like long term.
Yeah, well, especially like just considering how much of PlayStation has become like a worldwide company, and Nintendo is still very much a Japanese company with presence around the world. That like they have become so different.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's one of the great like gaming what ifs, right? What if they just stayed together? Okay. This is my penultimate game for this list, or entry for this. I think I may only have 2 things left, but I want to see. I want to verify. And actually, I'm calling an audible here, Mark. I'm gonna say the Super Star Wars games.
Oh, okay.
Games which are look, they're difficult and they're not great. And they have insane difficulty curves and spikes that don't make any sense. But if you watched The Mandalorian, the 3rd episode of The Mandalorian, when he is trying to get on that sand crawler to fight the Jawas that stripped his ship for parts, that is 100% the second level of Super Star Wars, where you are Luke Skywalker trying to climb up that thing to no avail. The games have beautiful sprites and really detailed animation, and they just sort of walk you through the stories of the original 3 Star Wars movies. And the gameplay is not very good or innovative, but they do mix it up all the time. There are vehicle levels. There are a ton of different characters that you play as. You play as Wicket at some point in the 3rd one. It's got such a fun variety, and just, well, it's not a good game. It very much feels like you are engaging with Star Wars.
Yes, yeah, and that's why it was such a fun experience as a kid, because there was Star Wars for the NES, and I remember renting that. But Super Star Wars was something else. It had like a pretty good rendition of the Star Wars themes.
Yep.
Like it felt like Star Wars. And you say it walked you through the stories of the movies, and it's like
walked you through the beats of the
because they had to fill it with a lot of action sequences that don't actually exist. So everything on Tatooine is super hostile.
Yes.
Everything on every world is like incredibly hostile. But especially that first sandcrawler level is blazed into my mind because it's so hard, and so I played that level so many times, failing to get past it. Super Star Wars for sure is a lot of fun.
Yeah, and like the games are full of those like behind the vehicle. Are those mode 7? I actually can't remember.
I don't know either. It seems like they could be.
They probably were. Yeah. But like the games were always good at like mixing it up with like a weird gameplay experience between the sort of standard side scrolling action. And you'd be like, oh great, this is a Jedi level. This is one where I have a lightsaber. Or you'd be like, oh man, this is one where I got to play as Han Solo. Well, it's like Han Solo is fun and all, but like He's got his blaster. Come on.
It was just fun to see those worlds like rendered
Yeah.
in what felt like at the time like such a like realistic and cool way.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, my final entry for this list is one that we've mentioned before, but I again think it deserves its own entry, and that is Super Mario World. I think the Super Mario World is probably the best pack-in game of all time. You bought a Super Nintendo and you got Super Mario World for free. It was just there.
Which is an outrageous value proposition because that game is so good.
Yeah.
It takes the concept of Super Mario Brothers 3, and this is another it's an example of the Nintendo just take the thing that they were doing before and just do it right this time. Not that it was wrong before, but like the existence of World makes 3 look like a mistake, if that makes sense.
I personally, I don't know that I'd go that far. I feel like they're different experiences. Like
Mhm.
I like 3 plays very different than World. 3, the levels are really short. They're very fast paced. World is about taking your time in platforming, exploring even more than Super Mario Brothers 3. Like lots of levels have multiple exits.
Mhm.
Like the world is so much more expansive. Like you said, it introduces Yoshi. Um, I remember my first exposure to a Super Nintendo was going to our cousin's house for Thanksgiving, and I was like aware that there was a new Nintendo thing, but we definitely did not own it, and I wasn't a subscriber to Nintendo Power at that point, and so like I wasn't getting that direct feed of Nintendo all the time, and so I remember going to my cousin's house and seeing Super Mario World and seeing the like Bowser fight
Yeah.
with the like hot air balloon like whirligig thing
Yeah. The
and
clown car.
it just blowing my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean it is a stunning game and has all of the things that we've been saying that are good about all these games of incredible music and like bright beautiful sprites. But I mean the thing that this game that Super Mario World has that um I feel like is something I always want more of from a Mario game is a clear and unique aesthetic.
Yeah.
Like no other game looks like Super Mario World. Mario's a little bit rounder than he is. His overalls are a little bit brighter. Like the greens are a little bit greener, the blues are a little bit bluer, the faces are a little bit chubbier. Everyone's a little bit more like worked up. I don't know what it is, but it's so charming and so specific.
Well, and it's also something that the Mario franchise we just like lost a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Like because
It's standardized.
yeah, like
Yeah.
yeah. Like every entry in the Mario series up to, arguably from Sunshine on, have shared a very similar aesthetic.
Yeah.
Whereas like Super Mario Brothers, Super Mario Brothers 2 in the US, Super Mario Brothers 3, Super Mario World, Super Mario 64, all of these look so different from each
Yeah.
other.
Yeah, and I just if Nintendo were to put out a Super Mario World 2, like a genuine Super Mario World 2, not Yoshi's Island, just a sequel to Super Mario World with that art style, I would be so happy.
Yeah.
It's thrilling. It is my preferred Mario to play in Super Mario Maker. It's just so fun and fluid, and just like the idea of jumping on a Goomba and throwing it around, like I don't know. It's all very appealing. And that cape, my God, the cape, the cape is an all timer. Mark, I think at this point, I'm not going to say this as my last entry, but I think we just got to give a shout out to Super Mario All Stars, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
The way a lot of people were introduced to the original Mario trilogy, and the way basically every American kid was introduced to the Lost Levels. Yeah, a great collection of
Yeah,
Mario
a great
games.
collection. The Super Nintendo wasn't backwards compatible, and so the only way that you could play these original Mario games from the NES on your Super Nintendo, they are the versions the quote unquote original that are imprinted in my brain because I played them, when my brain was more fully formed,
Right.
and way more than on the NES.
And to this day, it remains a crime that is not a playable, usable theme in Mario Maker.
Oh yeah,
Right? Like,
Yep.
where are these 16-bit Super Mario Brothers 3 graphics? Like,
yeah.
come on, let's put them in there. But only an honorable mention because, and again, we have talked about this game before on this show and on this episode of this show, but we have got to put Super Metroid as its own entry on this list, as it is sort of the blueprint for what Metroid could be in the future, what it can be. For me, it is like the high bar that needs to be cleared, or which maybe can never be cleared.
It is what, and it's not just for the Metroid series. It is what these like Metroidvania, the genre,
Yeah.
aspires to be. All of these indie games aspire to be Super Metroid.
Yeah, because it's such a satisfying formula of find the thing that gives you more access to the space that you've already been to, so that every time you walk into a room, you have a different experience of that room. And with the sole exception of Meridia, the like water area, which is too big and kind of too tough to navigate. Everything else is compact enough and small enough and visually distinct enough that you know where you're going. The second you get the high jump boots, the second you get the ice beam, the second you get the wave beam, you are like, oh my God, now I can do blank. And you go right there. And it's just like, it's so intuitive and smooth and wonderful.
And it's pretty remarkable that it works because the first two games are bad.
Obtuse. Yeah, totally. They both required the remakes to make them playable.
Yeah.
Super Metroid, you can't remake it. It can't be done. There'd be no reason to. But I also, and I know I've talked about it specifically on this show before, but the game's approach to storytelling and atmosphere is virtually unmatched ever. The way that it presents you with the baby Metroid that the beginning of the game is like doing this with like text on screen and sort of like still images as like cutscenes, and that's all fine. You're like getting introduced to the story, so like you're not tuned into anything revolutionary yet. This is all normal. But then throughout the course of playing the game, you encounter this Metroid again, but you don't recognize it because why would you? It's a monster. It's a Metroid. And it's a giant one at that. It sucks all the life out of you. And there's a moment where you're like, crap, I'm going to die. But then you don't die because the Metroid recognizes you and pulls away. It sort of squeals a little bit. And the game is not explaining anything to you at this point. You have to piece together. You have to remember. But like you know what's going on, right? Like it's so efficient in its storytelling that it doesn't need a single word on the screen to say, and then the Metroid recognized you and left you alone. It just happened. And then in your final fight with Mother Brain, Mother Brain's got you beat down too. How's the actual? Yes, so that's the sequence. She starts beating you down, and then is about to blast you with her hyper beam for the last time. Something that you've been hit with already and which dealt so much damage to you, and you're like, crap, I gotta start this whole fight again. Go back to my save point. And then that Metroid comes in and rescues you and attacks Mother Brain and absorbs all of her life force and then drops it back into you, powering you up. But then Mother Brain comes back to life and attacks the Metroid. Like, it's the drama is so effective and so good and so immediately clear without words. It's just told with 16-bit graphics and a fake orchestral score. And it's so moving and so complete. You just don't experience that in games.
It's a great one to end on because it is like the intersection of so many of the other things that we have praised like the Super Nintendo for.
Yeah.
Like all of that is so, I mean, really these last two, all the things that we love about the Super Nintendo are present in Super Mario World and Super Metroid. They're great like examples of why we love the Super Nintendo.
All right, Mark, those are our 30 favorite things about the Super NES. Let's close this out. What are your favorite things about the Super NES? Did we miss any of them? We have a pretty good list here, but I think there are probably more, and there are probably corners that we didn't touch on. No one even said NBA Jam, so like maybe this exercise is a sham. But please email us at Nintendo Cartridge Society at gmail.com if you would like us to talk about your favorite things on the Super NES. But that is going to do it for this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society. Remember, please rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts if you like the episode. You can share it on Facebook or Twitter or wherever you share stuff. We appreciate it when you do that. You can follow us on Twitter. I'm at Patrick_Ellers. Mark is at MKE Mitchell, and the show is at Cart Society. We also have a Facebook page, which is just Nintendo Cartridge Society. Olivia Duncan made our logo. Our theme music is provided by 8-Bit Betty. You can get more of his music by going to 8bitbetty.com. or by listening right now. For my co-host, Mark Mitchell, this is Patrick Eller saying happy birthday, Super NES, and thank you for listening.
Hey, Oscar, Rachel, do you like Disney movies?
Yeah!
Have you seen all of them?
Yeah, we saw all the Disney animated movies.
And we saw all the Pixar animated movies, too.
How about the DComs?
What?
The Disney Channel original movies. You should listen to our podcast, Inside the Disney Vault, because we are watching all of them in chronological order.
Yeah, and we do fun segments, like we cast each other.
That's right, and my favorite segment, Zaddy Watch, where we rank every single DCOM daddy.
Ooh, you can listen to all this fun stuff on our podcast, Inside the Disney Vault on Campfire Media, wherever you listen to podcasts.
All right, guys, let's get back in the vault. It's cold out here.
Campfire.